We have 30 minutes break right after the session, so therefore a little sleep over should be fine. I guess my transcripts didn't go well. 30 minutes, or the 3 demands.
So Corey, Volker, and Bill, we will do a short welcome presentation at the beginning, so only 5 minutes, and then we will start with Corey's talk.
Great.
Christian knows the schedule, so that's why.
You're welcome. Sit here if you want. I'm here lonely. People are just now walking in. You cannot hear me.
We can hear you. So yeah, just let us know when you're ready to start. And then you are doing the slides, Lisha, right?
So according to Meet Echo, we get 40 people in already. Maybe we can just start on time, given that the first few minutes will be just the planning. We need a note taker anyway. That's gonna take a few minutes. So do we want to get started?
You're very quiet, Lisha. We can't hear you.
I'm very quiet.
Closer.
Is it still very quiet?
Better.
Is it better?
Yeah.
Is this one better? I think so. That one seems somehow. So
think it's
Dirk,
okay.
I wonder if you want to get started.
Yes, let's start. So Lisha, I'm assuming that you are doing the intro. Is that correct?
I thought you're gonna do the intro.
Perfect. Okay, no problem. Okay. All right. Yeah, welcome to the DINRG meeting at IETF 117. My co-chair Lisha Zhang is in the room. My name is Dirk Kutscher. I'm sorry that I cannot be with you at this IETF. I'm currently on vacation in Denmark. Okay, so before we start, the usual thing, if you have been to some meetings, you know this. We are using Meet Echo for both the online and the on-site participation. So if you're participating in person, please also use the Meet Echo tool and to sign into the room and to manage the queue. And yeah, for our remote participants, please make sure your audio and video is off unless you are sharing or presenting. And we normally recommend using headsets. Quick note, so we are here in the Internet Research Task Force, and we are largely following the IETF IPR disclosure rules. So please familiarize yourself with it. In short, the idea is that you will let us know if you contribute or if you're aware of any IPR-related contribution, and do that in a short time frame. So we are also operating under the privacy and code of conduct here. So please note that all these meetings are recorded, and please also consider or be aware of the code of conduct that the IETF and IETF is operating under. So there's an RC 7154 on that, if you're not familiar. Quick update. So if you are on the DINRG mailing list, you probably have seen Colin's message. If you're not on the list, we recommend subscribing. So we had some discussions in the last meetings over rechartering the group, and thank you very much for all your comments and contributions. So we're very happy that the IAB has approved our new charter. And we're not going to read this out now, but you can find the text on the mailing list. But so in short, we want this group to be an open forum to discuss internet centralization, say phenomena and problems, and also a platform to facilitate coordination of efforts, identifying root causes, and discuss potential mitigating solutions in this direction. So this is the list of objectives. Let's not read this. We have discussed this a few times, but it's quite important that we really want to spend say quite some effort on say discussing root causes, but not only from a technical side, but also from an economic side and political side as well. And so we'll do a set of activities that we think are useful. We are currently in a discussion about what's the best way for documenting the outputs. So normally in the, say, IETF, when we do like technical specifications, we have internet drafts and RFCs, and we have some informational documents and so on. It's not quite clear whether this is the best format for all IETF research groups. And so DINRG may be also one of the groups where, say, other forms of documentation and, say, research outputs may be more useful. So we are currently thinking about, say, some kind of policy, how we want to, work with, say, the IETF process. What could be good outputs and say useful products from this group. So please stay tuned. We will make some proposals on this later. Quick information. So we had this very interesting DINRG workshop on centralization in 2021, and so we reported on this earlier, and so now a few weeks ago we also managed to write up the report in a more polished form and submit this as an editorial to ACM CCR, so for the July issue. So it should be published anytime now. So that's I think it's a good reference for the outcome of this workshop. So I think it's a really good outcome. All right, so please join the mailing list if you haven't done so. And for this meeting, as for all the other meetings, we really need a note taker to capture the gist of the discussions. So that works by volunteering efforts. And so we asked for one note taker on the mail list, but so far we're not able to convince anybody. So please let us know if you're able to help. Note-taking here doesn't mean you have to capture everything that's being said, but we are mainly interested in the gist of the discussion, so what has been asked and what are the answers.
We really need a note taker before we proceed. So thank you so much, Eve. So you're gonna help us doing note taking.
Eve is taking notes. Thanks a lot. Okay, great. There is this, there's the note-taking tool, so like a shared document, and so if you use that, then people can also help you with, say, adding additional stuff that may be missed, or adding names that are not heard correctly. All right, so this is our agenda. We have 3 talks today, quite interesting from like different angles on that problem. So we start with Cory Doctorow, and then have Volker Schocker and William Lehr, and then Christian Julien with a talk on some ideas for research in this field. And that's it from us. So I would say we just start with the presentation and give the floor to Cory. And I'll stop sharing. Cory, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me confirm before I start, you can all see me and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Very good. So thank you very much for having me today. It is an honor to address IETF, and especially in a subject as important as this one. The talk today, as you'll see maybe from the prospectus, is about platform decay. And the platform is the endemic form of the internet. But any intermediary sits in a place of irresistible temptation. When you sit between end users and business customers, that you have the power to shift value from both of them to your own shareholders. And that acts as a kind of perennial gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1. And after a couple of decades of lots and lots of platform growth, we are now in Act 3. And that gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1 is going off with quite a deafening fusillade. We are in this moment of a very visible, highly contagious platform decay, from Facebook and Instagram to Twitter and Twitch to Reddit and Discord and beyond. And there's a signature pathology to platform decay, a disease with a 3-stage procession. In the first stage of platform decay, you have firms that have a lot of access to the capital markets, and they use that to generate and offer surpluses to end users. And even as they do that and make a hospitable place to lure end users in, they leverage technical, economic, and behavioral factors to lock those users in so they can't readily leave. In stage 2, once the users are locked in, the platform starts to withdraw some surpluses from them and starts to hand them over to business customers. And it says to the business customers, not only have we got a rich and fertile place where you can come and find a lot of customers for your products and services, but we're also going to give you access to that at fire sale prices under very favorable conditions. And once, as those business customers pile in, the platforms again leverage technical, economic, and behavioral factors to make it hard for those customers to leave. And then you reach the end stage, stage 3, where the platform, now having locked in business customers and end users, begins to withdraw all available surpluses from both and reallocating them to its own shareholders. And the idea here is to leave behind just enough residual platform value that both groups of users remain locked in and don't just rush for the exits. And I call this process somewhat infamously enshittification. It's the process by which platforms start off as robust sites of value for both users and business customers, but then in the end turn into a pile of shit with no value for either. And as a use case here, I want to talk about how Facebook proceeded, because it's pretty canonical. So when Facebook started, it had a problem. Everybody who wanted to use social media already had an account on MySpace. The only people who were allowed to use Facebook were K-12 and university students with .edu addresses, and it needed to lure those people off of MySpace and onto their platform. So Facebook gave them two pitches that to convince them to leave. The first was, if you come to Facebook, we are only going to show you the things that you ask us to show you. You show up here, you articulate your social graph. Tell us who matters enough to you that you want to hear when they have something to say. And then every time they say something on the platform, we'll just put it in your feed. And the second thing they promised was, we will never, ever spy on you, right? Not like that service run by the evil, crepulent Australian billionaire MySpace. We are the privacy forward alternative where you can come and have a non-commodified social relation with your friends. Now, with social media, lock-in's actually quite easy. It comes built in with social media dynamics, because once the people you like are on a social media platform, they hold you hostage and you hold them hostage. You have this network effects driven growth where people join because they value the people who are already there, and then they make the service more value because other people value them. But the corollary of this network effects driven growth is that it's very hard to leave. That there's this high collective action problem associated with going. You know, those of you who are there in person today in San Francisco, when like 8 of you try to decide where to go for drinks tonight, you're going to have to argue about it for 45 minutes. If that were, 180 of you in a social graph on Facebook, all trying to agree whether it is time to leave Facebook, and if so, where you should go, you're basically hopelessly mired in this collective action problem. So Facebook's customers lock themselves into the network, and they stay there because of the high switching costs of going. It's not that they like Facebook, but they like the people who are on Facebook. They value their communities, they value their family, they value their friends, they value their customers. Axiomatically, that's what they're there for. So at this critical juncture, Facebook starts to draw down the surpluses that it allocated to those users in the form of what we could call a clean feed and a privacy respecting environment, and started to reallocate those to business users. So it turned to the advertisers and it said, hey, do you remember when we promised our users that we were never, ever going to spy on them, not like that evil Australian billionaire? It turned out we were lying, and we're going to spy on them from dusk till dawn, and we're going to build fine-grained targeting tools. We're going to task a lot of an engineering resource to make sure that there isn't ad fraud or ad abuse. When you pay for an ad, someone's going to see it. And we're not going to charge you very much for it. We're going to offer very competitive rates. And to publishers, they said, hey, do you remember when we told those users we were only going to show them the things that they asked to see from the people that they chose to follow? That was also a lie. If you post small excerpts with links to your own website that you have some means of monetizing, we will just like non-consensually cram them into the eyeballs of those users who never asked to see them, and we'll generate a traffic funnel for you. And some of those users will even subscribe to you. You won't even have to rely on our recommendation system because they're going to choose to follow you. Now, digital tools have got this incredible flexibility that is lacking in the traditional analog markets. Digital tools allow for rapid repricing, rapid changes to business logic, and so on. And so it was possible for Facebook's management to subtly alter the conditions to make these firms more reliant on Facebook, and also to extract value from them one little drib and drab at a time. So, for example, it could reduce somewhat the policing of ad fraud, or raise the prices a little, or be less careful about targeting. With the publishers, it started to require larger and larger excerpts from their posts before they would be shown, not just as a recommendation, but even to the people who'd asked to see them. And that culminated with a regime in which your posts are very unlikely to be shown to anyone unless you remove all links from them on the grounds that they might be malicious links, and also include the full text of the article, which means that you are now just a content provider for Facebook, and Facebook is no longer a funnel driving traffic to your site. All the value has been extracted, but your readers are there, and so you have to be there. And then you get to the final stage where they're really drawing down all the value to the bare minimum, and they're saying things to publishers like, well, even the people who subscribe to you aren't going to see the post, even if it's the whole text of the post, even if you haven't linked back to your site. You're going to have to pay to boost your post so that the people who explicitly asked to see it will actually see it. Likewise, advertisers face an incredible burden of ad fraud. They face extremely high prices. And then to add insult to injury, you have the Jedi Blue collusion, an illegal collusive arrangement between Google and Facebook that was revealed in the Texas Attorney General's lawsuit against Facebook, where by surfacing memos where the management of both companies memorialized it. And this was a bid rigging system to charge advertisers more and pay publishers less and scoop higher commissions for them. And for the publishers, you also got other scams and forms of fraud, like the pivot to video, where Facebook falsely claimed that it was getting an enormous amount of views for videos on the platform in a bid to get publishers to finance an attempt to compete with YouTube. And so the publishers went out to the capital markets, raised a lot of money, either as debt or as equity, spent billions, laid off their print newsrooms, all chasing illusory users who indeed never materialized. And it was a mass extinction event for media. So let's talk about this late stage of infification. This is the stage where firms reap all the value except for the bare minimum that retains business customers and end users. And one of the problems of the late stage enshittification is it quickly gives way to end stage enshittification. That's where end users and business customers bolt for the exits because the cost of using the platform outweigh the benefits. And the reason that late stage and end stage are so close together is because the distinction between almost but not quite useless and useless is very fine, and the equilibrium that sits at almost but not quite useless is very brittle and difficult to maintain. It can be a firm can be knocked out of that equilibrium by exogenous shocks, a whistleblower, a privacy scandal, a live stream mass shooting. All of a sudden people flip from I hate this but I can't live without it to I'm leaving in just an instant. And that's when firms begin to thrash, or the term of art for this is pivoting. And, the canonical example of this in recent years is Facebook reinventing itself as Meta, insisting that our future is to live out our lives as heavily surveilled, low resolution, legless, sexless cartoon characters in a virtual world named for a joke in a dystopian science fiction novel published in the last millennium. So these very large, durable platforms that are now going through this mass extinction event, now teetering on the brink of collapse, they're anomalous in tech. Tech has always had the potential for explosive growth fueled by network effects. We've had firms pop up overnight and grow to unimaginable size, but firms in tech have also always been subject to implosive contraction because of low switching costs. We don't know how to make a computer that runs all the programs except for the ones that are disfavored by a company's shareholders. And that's why switching costs are intrinsically low in tech. The only computer we know how to make is the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine that runs every program we know how to write. And that means that it's always possible to turn a network effect on its head. If there's a dominant mainframe company that's making a lot of margin on its peripherals, someone else can show up and make interoperable peripherals and eat their lunch. If there's a dominant printer company that's charging high margins for ink, someone can show up and make an interoperable ink cartridge and eat their lunch. If there's a dominant operating system that is making an enormous profit on its Office suite, someone can show up and make an interoperable Office suite. If there's a dominant social media platform like MySpace, you can do what Facebook did, which is allow users to depart by giving them a bot that you give your login credentials to that periodically visits MySpace, impersonates you, scrapes the messages that are waiting for you on MySpace, puts them in your Facebook inbox, lets you reply to them there, and then autopilots them back out to your MySpace outbox. The latent, inescapable interoperability of all digital services has always acted as a check on growth. It's always been the other half of the cycle. Firms grow very quickly because of network effects, and they implode very quickly because of low switching costs. You remember Jeff Bezos early on in Amazon's history told the book publishers, "Your margin is my opportunity." That is the historic rallying cry of new technology entrants. A new company can disrupt a highly profitable incumbent by selectively attacking just the profitable parts of its business. The more money an incumbent makes on ads, the more valuable an ad blocker is and the more you can sell it for. The network effects driven growth and low switching cost driven contraction is why tech has historically been so dynamic, with big firms popping up and then going away. DEC gives way to Compaq, Compaq becomes a division of HP, and then it's no more. But tech today is stagnant. We live in what Tom Eastman calls the internet of 5 giant websites, each filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And it's important to figure out how we got here. It starts with the drawdown on merger policing. Until about 40 years ago, mergers were considered highly suspect, especially among firms in the same sector, both horizontal and vertical mergers. But about 40 years ago, with the rise of Reagan-era antitrust, a policy that has been amplified by every administration since up to the current one, which has reversed this 40-year decline, we have welcomed mergers as axiomatically efficient, as producing firms that are going to do better for their users. And we've treated monopoly as evidence that a company is doing something right rather than doing something wrong. And that's how you get giants like Google. Google made the greatest search engine in the history of the world. I don't know if you remember those days, but it was like sorcery, how good that search engine was. And that gave them a lot of access to the capital markets. And then that was the end. Because while Google has basically not made a successful product in-house since, from its RSS readers to its social media networks to its video platform, basically the things that Google makes die, it has nevertheless been able to acquire a video platform, a mobile platform, an ad tech stack, server management stack, maps, collaboration, docs, navigation, satellite, all of this stuff by buying companies, by buying other people's ideas. Google is a one idea company with deep pockets. It's not Willy Wonka's idea factory. It's Uncle Pennybags, just buying up everybody who has a good idea. So as firms accumulate market power, they're able to convert that market power to political power. When an industry is dominated by a small number of firms, it is able to reliably secure regulation that's favored to it. First, that's because when you have a small number of firms, they don't have to compete as much as they used to. Think of Google and Facebook dividing up the ad market with Jedi Blue, the way the Pope divided up the New World for Spain and Portugal. And so you just don't have what Peter Thiel calls wasteful competition. Peter Thiel says competition is for losers. So now that they've got all this dry powder, they can decide how to mobilize it to overcome the collective action problem of deciding how to spend that money. When there's a small number of firms in a sector, they can all get together and agree on what their priorities should be. And to understand how this plays out, think back to the Napster wars. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the tech industry was so much larger in aggregate than the entertainment industry. But the majority of tech firms then were fiercely competitive SMEs, and their competition drove down their margins, depriving them the excess rents that they would spend on lobbying. And they also faced a powerful collective action cost because they squabbled with one another about how to respond to the shifts in regulation, legislation, and litigation. Meanwhile, the entertainment companies were a very cozy oligopoly of a handful of firms. Today, it's even more concentrated: 5 publishers, 4 studios, 3 labels. Back then, there were 2 or 3 more in each of those sectors. And they were able to all get together and decide what to do. And they kick technology's butt all around the world. So today, tech is as concentrated as content was in those Napster days, and it shows. On the one hand, tech forestalls the passage of legislation that allows them to change the business logic of their services in order to extract surpluses from users. This is the key to enabling enshittification. If we had strong privacy laws, or if Europe was able to enforce its privacy laws, or if we applied labor standards to gig workers and performers and the publishers who use platforms, or if the FTC had been exercising its powers under Section 5 of the FTC Act to ban search result auctions and other anti-features as unfair and deceptive, it would be much harder for platforms to allocate, withdraw, dangle, and take away the surpluses that lure in users and then lock them in, lure in business customers and lock them in. On the other hand, it's not just that tech has been able to stop regulation from happening. They've been able to get regulation and regulatory interpretation that's favorable to its interests and that cut against the interests of new market entrants who would make interoperable products. Colloquially, we call this basket of regulations to block new market entrants IP. And this is all of these things like anti-circumvention, tortious interference, cybersecurity claims under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, patent claims, copyright claims, non-disclosure claims, trade secrecy claims, binding arbitration claims, and so on. You may be familiar with this debate in software circles about whether IP is imprecise or deceptive, whether we should even use it. But when you think of it in this way, IP has a very crisp, if colloquial, meaning in business circles. When IP is used in a firm, it means any rule, law, or policy that allows the firm to reach beyond its four walls in order to exert control over the conduct of its customers, its critics, and its competitors. That is to say, IP is the charter that lets you force unrelated third parties to arrange their affairs to your commercial benefit. It's what Jay Freeman from the Cydia Project calls felony contempt of business model. IP is where we get lock-in, and the monotonous growth of IP has allowed the firms who secured a potentially temporary advantage in the first decade or so of the 2000s to convert that into what seems like a permanent advantage. IP is why you can't reverse engineer the Facebook app and allow users to defect to community-run platforms and still continue to exchange messages with the people who stay behind. It's why ad blocking on the web is the most successful consumer boycott in history, but ad blocking for an app is a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence under Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's why we don't have unified inboxes for all the social services, multiple services we use. It's why we can't create standalone, third-party, unsanctioned recommendation systems that draw from TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube and allow performers to opt into their own monetization schemes. In other words, monopolization allows companies to forestall policies that would interfere with network effects-driven growth, and it allows those dominant firms to secure IP policies that prohibit the marketing and sale of tools that enable low switching cost fueled contraction. So we're about to get California fire season. You're in the Bay Area now. If you were to come back in not too long, there's a pretty good chance that the entire city would be wreathed in smoke. These fires come every year. And for millennia, the First Nations people of California practiced controlled fire burns, forest burns. And the burns cleared out the brush, they made space in the canopy, and they culled weak trees. But a couple of centuries ago, settlers declared war on fire, and they ended that cycle of controlled demolition and new growth. And today, California has an inconceivable fire debt. Even without the climate emergency that's around us, California would still have punishing annual fires because there's just too much dead, rotten wood in our forests. The way out of the annual cycle of out-of-control fires is to restore a cycle of controlled fires. We have to end the war on fire and allow some forests to burn every year. But instead, what we keep doing is trying to make the wildland-urban interface safe for habitation, spending more and more money and resources to lure people into those combustible zones. We should be evacuating those zones, not making them more hospitable. Now, platforms should be turning over. There is nothing wrong with platform collapse. We don't need Facebook. We don't need a better Mark Zuckerberg. Like all billionaires, Mark Zuckerberg is a policy failure. Like all dictators ruling over massive platforms, Mark Zuckerberg is a factory for producing policy failures at scale. We need to stop focusing on making Mark Zuckerberg better at running Facebook. The problem of having an unelected social media czar who unilaterally determines the social lives of 4 billion people isn't merely that he's bad at that job. The problem is that that job exists at all. We should stop trying to perfect Zuck or replace him with someone who's better at his job, and instead we should be abolishing Zuck. It's okay for forests to burn, and it's okay for platforms to collapse. Our focus shouldn't be preserving the crepuscular senescence of dying platforms. The focus should be on easing the path of platform users as they depart for the next pasture. Every demand for platform governance is a demand for policing platform users' conduct, whether that's SESTA FOSTA or the lawful but awful regimes that ask platforms to police inhospitable speech on their platforms or related policies. And every one of these requirements to police users becomes a pretext for preventing interoperators, because you can't police what you can't control. You can't control what you can't observe. We can't ask Facebook or TikTok or Twitter to stop their users from misbehaving and also demand that they cede power over those users and cease the endless surveillance of those users. So let me conclude by giving some examples of policies that let us treat these highly combustible, often on fire platforms as damage and route around them. The first is to restore the end-to-end principle with a rule that requires platforms to connect willing senders with willing receivers. If I subscribe to your feed, I should see what you post to it. If I search for your goods, giving the exact model number or SKU, that model should be at the top of the search results. If I hoist an email out of a spam folder and mark it as not spam, that sender's mail shouldn't go to my spam folder thereafter. I mean, it was bizarre last year that Congress had a debate about whether unsolicited fundraising emails from hopeful Congress people should be marked as spam. And they ignored the much more salient debate about whether the solicited emails that you asked to see from your elected representatives should go to spam even after you mark them as not spam. Now, beyond the end-to-end principle, I want to establish the right to exit. You may have heard a story about Mastodon.lol. This was a Fediverse server with 12,000 users, and a fight broke out there over the new Harry Potter game. And the administrator decided to shut down the server. Now, this may sound terrible to you, but Mastodon has this easy mechanism for migrating to another server. You export the list of your followers with one click, and then with another click, you import them into another Mastodon server and you get back up and running. The 12,000 users on Mastodon.lol have it better than the 250 million users on Twitter who can't leave the platform without losing all their followers and everyone they follow, shattering their social network. A right to exit rule would build on existing data protection laws, requiring both large and small platform operators to provide users with machine-readable files that can be used to reestablish yourself on other platforms. And unlike other intermediary regulations like rules about lawful but awful speech or copyright filter mandates, this rule is not a capital moat to prevent new market entrants. It costs nothing to run a server that hands over this data when the Fediverse already has this built into its reference code. And it is eminently administratable. Anytime a Twitter user or a user on Mastodon.lol alleges that they weren't provided with their data when they got kicked off the server, we don't need a long fact-finding mission where we depose the engineers who run the service. We just call up Facebook or Twitter, or we call up Mastodon.lol, and we say to the administrator, I know you say you gave this user their data. They say they didn't get it. Let's just settle it by you giving them another copy of it. So we don't have to create a parallel corporate civil justice system to adjudicate content moderation calls or decisions to remove users. We can just make it easier for end users and business customers to go elsewhere. And this makes the content moderation stakes lower and makes content moderation easier. And when content moderation failures do lead to mass user defections, tech firms will have strong incentives to improve their content moderation departments. Regulation disciplines firms over the long term, and disastrous quarterly reports sharpen the attention of even the most Adderall-dependent tech founder. Enshittification is not foreordained. It is the predictable, inevitable outcome of three policy choices. The choice to allow firms to grow through anti-competitive measures, predatory pricing, and other conduct that was historically prohibited until Reagan. Second, the unfettered capacity to twiddle the knobs on the back end to alter business logic, enabling algorithmic wage discrimination and other unfair and deceptive practices. And finally, restrictions on the user side's counter-twiddling with broad indiscriminate IP restrictions on reverse engineering, scraping, bots, and other adversarial interoperability tactics that today's tech giants all use to attain the high perches from which they decry these tactics. They say, when we did it to others, that was progress. And when you try to do it to us, that is theft, because every pirate wants to be an admiral. Tech barons aren't evil wizards who hacked our dopamine loops. They're just the ordinary mediocrities deploying the same tactics as their Gilded Age forebears, but faster and with computers. John Rockefeller couldn't lay a railroad or put in a new oil pipeline with a mouse click, but Jeff Bezos can change the business logic of Amazon by just twiddling a knob. And in any shell game, the quickness of the hand deceives the eye. If we focus on the material factors that allow firms to prolong their senescence, the deceptive and unfair practices that lure in users and fuel the rapid network effects-driven growth, and the wielding of legal privilege to block interoperability and artificially increasing switching costs, allowing for lock-in, then we get rid of the self-serving mystique of the tech genius. We can keep users safe in controlled burns that clean out the rotten giants that have crowded out the sunlight and oxygen that would allow new growth. So to close, we need to keep up with our antitrust remedies. The best time to have prevented monopoly formation was 40 years ago, and the second best time is now. We should be cheering on the FTC as they challenge rotten mergers like Activision, Microsoft, and as they seek to unwind historic mergers undertaken on false pretenses like Facebook, Instagram. We should be seeking to limit platform twiddling, passing and enforcing muscular labor and consumer protection rules, ending worker misclassification that allows the abuse of platform gig workers, and enacting long overdue American federal privacy law with private rights of action. And finally, we need to reinvigorate user-side twiddling by reforming IP law, enforcing laws like Europe's DMA, and making interoperability an ironclad element of all public procurement. Enshittification is not inevitable, but allowing companies to gobble each other up in an orgy of consolidation, to twiddle their knobs with every hour that God sends, and prohibiting users from twiddling back, of course, results in a world where we are all being twiddled to death. But the alternative, where we seize the means of computation, could give us the web that we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corey. Do we have questions? Yes.
Jeff is first.
Yes.
Jeff Houston, thank you very much for that talk. It was quite enlightening. It reminded me of what's happening now with what happened in the 1890s in the Gilded Age in this particular country. And interestingly, once you'd bought your market and bought all your competition, you bought your future. JP Morgan, Standard Oil. Is the real issue here not the fact that they're buying each other, but they're actually making remarkable grip holds on the future of all of us and not relinquishing it? And I echo the concerns, I think it was Louis Brandeis in the Supreme Court in the 1920s, wasn't it? Is it the actions of big that is the problem? Or is big its own problem? Is it the sheer size and the absolute dominance that really causes these phenomenal distortions? What's your view on that?
So I think that the size doesn't necessarily cause distortions, although size is prone to a lot of distortions. You know, you think about the coordination problems within large firms. I think we've all probably read The Mythical Man Month, and we understand that, you know, adding more people to a project makes it later, right? And so when you ask yourself, like, how is it that Google managed to make the best search engine into the worst search engine? I think that, you know, you get some of that out of scale, where you have a company that has, you know, a 90+% search dominance. Google's not going to grow its search business by attracting new searchers. It can only grow by extracting surpluses from people who search and people whose things are searched for. And within the firm, you have a lot of different product managers whose KPIs and whose bonuses, which are quite substantial, depend on finding ways to increase the profitability of their corner of the firm. And so they're all sitting there going, well, I can't grow by attracting new search users. I can only grow by whittling away at the value that the two sides of the search market get. And so I'm going to pull out this Jenga block. But of course, nobody is coordinating a Jenga block removal strategy, right? So you have adjacent Jenga blocks being removed and important things fall over. So like last week, every major airline in America's phone number on Google was replaced with a phone number for a boiler room full of scam artists who would take your credit card number and steal from you. Right. And I don't know exactly how that happened, but presumably it was something like someone said, well, we have a cost center associated with validating phone number changes. And we can realize some efficiency in that cost center, either by drawing down human oversight or drawing down the amount of oversight that each human does, or by having self-serve platforms, something that made it cheaper. Right. And they made the firm more profitable, but at this enormous expense. And, you know, ultimately, like, the end stage of enshittification is the pile of shit, right? So the end stage of this is that people defect, right? And there's, like, you're seeing this with Twitter, you're seeing it with Facebook. There's a real hunger to go elsewhere and to try other things. And no one really knows what that's going to be. But, you know, the scale is definitely a part of it. As to, you know, whether all other things being equal, if scale is a problem anyway, I think it is. And I think it's a problem for two reasons. The first is, even if you're like a hardcore libertarian and you think the only reason that we should have a government is to enforce contracts, that government's contract enforcement function relies on it having power that the firms whose contracts are being issued and signed, it dominates, right? If the referee is less powerful than the team, then the team can cheat. And so if you want a small government, you need firms that are smaller than that government. And the second thing is that even if we stipulate that these companies are well run by people who are very smart, they will still make errors because nobody's perfect. And when you have that much scale gathered into one set of fallible hands, those mistakes redound much further, right? Mark Zuckerberg's judgment errors are much more consequential than mine. I don't think they're necessarily worse. I mean, you can talk to my wife. She will tell you about my judgment errors. There are many and significant. But the worst thing that happens is I make my wife and daughter angry at me. I don't ruin 4 billion people's digital lives. And so I think that's the other dangerous scale. And you know, approximately you could think of this as too big to fail and too big to jail.
Thank you.
Bill, are you in the queue? Do you want to ask a question? If not, then let's take Martin's question first.
Hi, Martin Duke. First of all, thank you for this talk. I'm blown away and have a ton to think about, and it's a new way of looking at the world. So that's always an amazing feeling. So I work for Google, which, you know, is maybe more fraught in some ways than as you presented. I'm also one of the transport area directors here at IETF, so I approve no work, and I try hard to keep those two things separate. You've spoken a lot about legal remedies and, you know, legislative remedies and regulatory remedies for all this, which is frankly like above the pay grade of a lot of the people here. One dynamic that you did not touch on, which I think is relevant to like the sort of technical ground floor level of a lot of these phenomena, is that as a person who is fairly heavily involved in improving new work, one thing we have to ask is, here's some interoperability standard. Of course, we're dedicated to interoperability, and you know, we very much share that value with what you've presented here. But one thing we have to ask is, like, who's going to implement this? And like usually, and so like if Google's not going to do it and Apple's not going to do it, like why do it? And that turns, and you know, it's in some ways that's a reasonable question to ask, but it also very much enforces a lot of the dynamics that you've introduced. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about how we in the technical community can help combat some of these phenomena without like getting fired.
Well, I do have some thoughts about how we get there. And Dirk, am I allowed to talk about a book I have coming out, or does that violate like a self-promotion norm here? Is that okay?
Go ahead. Yes, okay.
Sure. So I've got this book coming out from Verso in September, How to Seize the Means of Computation. And it's a kind of roadmap for building and administering interops rules and actually getting them implemented. And I think of this through the lens of firms' preferences, where companies would, to a first order, would like to have walled gardens, right? They'd like to be able to capture value, or at best to offer APIs that represent a kind of commercial advantage to them, but not a disadvantage. And they want to be able to draw down that API when it doesn't make sense to them commercially, and so on. But what they really just prefer, even more than having being forced to offer an API that actually allows for competitive interoperability, is not being able to use legal remedies against people who reverse engineer their services. That, you know, whenever there's a company that enters the market by creating a bot or a scraper, or, you know, reversing an app and making an interoperable app or whatever, you know, the firm's upper management, like, they walk out of their office and, like, on the one side they have a building full of lawyers, and on the other side they have a building full of engineers. And they could walk into the building full of engineers and they could say, like, tighten up our firewall rules, you know, make the intrusion detection system better, do some stuff, right? And on the other side, they have the lawyers, and they can say, just go and threaten them under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act or the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act or tortious interference. They always go to the building full of lawyers. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that, like, engineers are scarce. second is that reverse engineering is an unquantifiable risk to firms, right? Like they don't know how much engineer time it's going to take to fight this guerrilla war. And then finally, like there's always an attacker's advantage, right? Like the red team needs to find one mistake that you made to block scraping or bots or interop, and the blue team has to make no mistakes, right? So they're always going to be in kind of a world of hurt when they're in reverse engineering land. So they go to the lawyers and they say to the lawyers, go and make an example of these people, right? Let the world see that if you build Power Ventures dashboard or OG app for Instagram or any of these other services that came and went very quickly because of legal threats or lawsuits, let them see what happens. Let their potential investors see what happens. Let hackers who are thinking about doing a startup find out what happens so that they don't even try, right? So my theory is that if on the one hand we have some mandates, and there's different ways that we're going to get them. In Europe, the Digital Markets Act is already mandating interoperability in order to allow competitive new services to enter the market and users to leave with low switching costs. We're going to have some mandates. We'll also probably get some mandates because there are all these consent decrees against the large firms. And going back to the curse of bigness, that like companies find it very hard to color within the lines. The kind of micro incentives are always to cheat or to push against them. And so whatever like settlement they last came to where they pinky swore they weren't going to do the bad thing anymore, they're breaking it right now. And so this opens the opportunity for new settlements, and those new settlements can come with interoperability requirements. And then we can also like get interoperability requirements through things like government procurement, right? So like Lincoln refused to buy rifles unless they had standard tooling and ammo for like the extremely obvious good reason that you can't say like, sorry boys, war's canceled today. Our sole supplier decided not to make bullets this week, right? So we could just say that like as a matter of public policy, if you supply goods to a public agency, state, federal, local, you have to covenant not to block interoperability among third parties or stand up an API or both. And then when you have both of these things, right, when you have the mandate and you have permission for interoperators to do the things that Apple did when they made iWork Suite, that the Seven Dwarves did when they were making drives and keyboards for IBM 360s, that Google did when it showed up and told websites in 1998 that its user agent was a browser and got copies of all the websites, right? Like that reverse engineering, that interoperability, if you restore that power, right, to interoperate without permission, to do adversarial interoperability, and you couple that with a mandate, then companies for preference are going to color within the lines for the mandate because they don't want their new market entrants to go from like, oh, the API is down or it's slow or it's ineffective. We'll just switch to scraping. And now you've just got to commit like an unknown number of engineers to fighting the scrapers, right? And so they'll just say, okay, let's just like make the API work, because while we would prefer not to have a competitive API, we would prefer even more not to have an unquantifiable risk. And so if we just like know what the rules of the road are, we know how the API works, we can observe it, we can know how our competitors are using it, we can plan for it, we can observe trends in it, then that's what we're going to focus on. Now, as to what individual technologists can do, you know, I like to quote my arch nemesis here, Milton Friedman, the architect of the Chicago School of Economics. You know, in the years when he was in the wilderness and people were saying like, Milton, you have all these ideas for destroying everything people love about the post-war consensus, where people have like healthcare and education and pensions and so on. How are you ever going to convince people to give up these things they loved? He said, look, there will always be a crisis. And in a time of crisis, ideas lying around can move from the periphery to the center. Right now, whenever there's a tech crisis, we just do the same thing we did last time, but harder, and hope we get a different outcome. I think that if technologists are out there saying, hey, you know, like the root here of the problem is not that like Facebook made a mind control ray to sell your nephew fidget spinners and then like Robert Mercer stole it and made your uncle a racist QAnon, but rather they just have a monopoly over what you see, and that's a thing we shouldn't have. And they got it through these technical means, and here's what the technical countermeasures should be. If that's the level of our discourse, rather than mystical stuff about dopamine loops, then we actually have the opportunity to have better solutions move in any of these foreseeable crises on our horizon, because the forest is on fire, and it's on fire all the time. because these firms are not in a stable state because they're big and they're screwed up. And, you know, they went from like making these intrinsic promises to smart technologists like you, come work for Google for 5 years, figure out how the business works, quit and start a business that competes with Google, to come work for Google for 5 years, figure the business works, start a business that competes with Google and Google will buy it, to come and work for Google for 5 years and get free kombucha and massages, but don't think of starting your own business, to come work for Google and you're lucky you still have a job because we just fired 12,000 of your colleagues after doing a stock buyback that would have paid all of their salaries for the next 27 years, right? Like this is not a stable situation.
All right.
Kombucha is very good, but thank you.
I like kombucha too.
Thank you very much, Corey. That was really insightful and quite interesting. I'm sure there are many, many more questions, but we really have to move on.
Yeah, fair. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So for those who are not aware, we have a chat feature here, and there's a lively discussion already in the chat channel. So if there are more questions or more feedback or more ideas, please use that, or also use our mail list for more substantial discussions. Corey, if you have some time and you are up for it, it would be great if you could check out the chat and continue the discussion there.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll hang out.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
So let's move on and let's have Volker and Bill with their presentation. And Volker, please start sharing.
Can you hear me, Dirk?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. So, and then can you see my screen, everyone? Not the presentation mode.
I have to approve it, but in a second we'll see it.
Can you hear me, Volker? I can't see your screen yet.
Ken?
Okay. Not yet.
Not yet. I'm not seeing anybody's screen. Still not.
You have the presentation rights, but it's not coming through.
I've never used this platform before. Volker, you know what you're doing?
Yeah, no, it's coming.
Okay.
There?
Yes.
Okay, yep, those are our slides. All right.
Wonderful. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honor and pleasure to speak to you today. Thanks very much for the gracious invitation. This is my first IETF meeting and already a really exciting session, so thanks very much. My name is Volker Stocker, and alongside my esteemed colleague Bill Lehr, we are here to talk about ecosystem evolution and digital infrastructure policy changes. Well, we're not really here in San Francisco, obviously, but we are joining you from the Swiss Alps, where it is rather late and where I am, and from an island in Maine, not a main island where Bill is. So since both of us will speak, we hope that our connectivity will be decent throughout the talk, so bear with us. And since Bill and I are economists, our goal today is to navigate the landscape a bit and provide high-level insights and reflections on the topic, all obviously from an economics perspective. Now, Bill and I, as I said, are economists interested in all kinds of aspects related to the economics, evolution, and regulation of digital infrastructures and the internet ecosystem. That being said, Bill and I both have broad experience in interdisciplinary research, often collaborating with technologists from fields like engineering or computer science. So this session really is a wonderful initiative that brings together experts from diverse fields and with different perspectives. So my compliments again for facilitating such a fruitful exchange. But now, without further ado, let's dive into our presentation. Now, as we are all aware, we are in the midst of a digital transformation. While the pace at which the digital or virtual and non-digital worlds are converging has arguably increased, the internet ecosystem has undergone tremendous evolution, and it has not only changed significantly, but it also continues to do so. So let's briefly take a look at some of these changes. Note that due to the time constraints of this presentation, of course, Bill and I won't be able to provide a comprehensive or detailed overview today, but we will concentrate on highlighting some major issues that we believe warrant attention, aiming to stimulate and inform further discussion. So in doing so, we lean on the body of work we've conducted on related topics over the years. To start with, we observe an ever-evolving variety of applications and services that differ greatly in their demands for network performance and capacities, cloud-based computation, security, and so on. Arguably responding to the need for more extensive capabilities to efficiently support ever more demanding applications and a wider range of requirement profiles, if you will, the way the internet is interconnected, where servers are placed, data is stored and processed, and how and from where content and application services are distributed and delivered have experienced a seismic shift. In fact, interconnection points, network computing resources, servers, and thus content applications and computing capabilities have been moved closer to end users and devices. For example, a large share of today's internet traffic is delivered via highly distributed serving infrastructures that make use of off-net servers deployed within the networks of ISPs. Now, this shift to the edge points to a localization of network traffic and of network computing resources. On top of that, we observe a flattening and densification of the interconnection fabric that has expanded routing options and interconnection diversity. Now, in today's ecosystem, service provision is based on a complex and evolving amalgam of interconnected and complementary network computing and communications network resources. So basically cables, routers, switches, servers, and so on. Many of those are owned and managed or controlled by different entities, which are often competing and have different goals. Some are open and publicly shared, while others are dedicated or managed in a proprietary fashion. In recent years, let's say the focus of academic research and policy debates on the internet has somewhat shifted towards some, if you will, new kids on the block, like a group of non-ISP actors, such as large content and application providers, sometimes referred to as hypergiants, and including large digital platform providers. Broadly speaking, many of these entities have invested in their own global and proprietarily managed networks, comprised of servers, routers, and cables, physical or virtual, that they utilize for service delivery. In recent years, many of these providers have expanded their network footprints and off-net server presence within ISP networks. While this implies that they embrace, say, more distributed and decentralized infrastructures and architectures, the management and control of the respective resources remains centrally with the respective providers. When we shift our focus, though, to what is sometimes called 5G plus, next generation networks, and the need for an anticipated role of local or edge clouds, things look a bit different, right? And other actors are likely involved in managing and orchestrating the relevant resources. So it's complicated. And both Bill and I have worked on these issues for several years, and we will continue to do so. Now, but what's the consequence of this? So what we can say is that as a, say, direct result of the transformations and shifts I've just highlighted, value chain constellations and configurations in today's ecosystem have grown more complex, diverse, and dynamic. For instance, we witness a complex fabric of both vertical relationships, such as between platforms and complementers, and horizontal relationships like the interconnections between networks via peering. This increased complexity is manifested in a richer variety of collaborations and integration strategies, as well as complementarities and synergies. These changes have been reflected in changing ownership and governance structures, industry structures, as well as competitive and innovational dynamics. In summary, today's ecosystem is characterized by an unprecedented diversity and complexity. The continual evolution of this environment has given rise to an array of novel challenges, which, as we will discuss today, require novel responses from various private and public ecosystem actors. Now, with this in mind, I want to walk you through some reflections from an economist's perspective. Again, given the time constraints we're facing, I will keep this brief and high level and non-exhaustive. First, when we talk about the essential digital infrastructure required for a digital economy future, this is about more than just connectivity and broadband. More specifically, broadband and ISP access is not all that is needed for a digital future. Indeed, substantial complementary investment is necessary, both upstream and downstream. Take, for instance, cloud computing, which is becoming increasingly critical, right? Often local and at the edge, for the effective delivery of numerous application services that have stringent low latency requirements. Perhaps tactile internet applications, think of dynamic control problems or so. Moreover, when we think about essential infrastructure for a digital economy future, this will be better about, let's say, what we call it, or Bill calls it mostly, smart X application, where the X in smart X can be replaced by the specific context benefiting from ICT augmentation. Examples are smart grids, smart healthcare, smart cities, smart supply chains, smart logistics, you name it. There are many others. And it's not just about building a more capable video and entertainment distribution platform. Or why would we invest, especially public money? Finally, there is a need to consider codependencies and co-evolution of different investments, as well as components owned and managed by different entities. This links to the point I made before about more complex and diverse value chain constellations and configurations. Second, the majority of the requisite investment will be private and delivered in a market-driven fashion. While public funding will likely have a significant role to play, a point on which Bill will elaborate further in a minute, it is crucial to recognize that investment will come from a variety of stakeholders with diverse objectives. Again, this group includes access ISPs, content application providers, CDNs, upstream ISPs, and also end users. Third, considering the variety of stakeholders, along with the complexity and heterogeneity of applications and usage environments, and the subsequent diversity of networking and computing requirements, we can foresee the increasing relevance and necessity for more and new forms of resource sharing. More complex and granular needs for resource allocation and orchestration in real time will emerge. On the one hand, we're witnessing the evolution of architectures and services, highlighting the crucial need for cooperation and coordination among diverse stakeholders. This is particularly important within the context of varying value chains and service delivery chain configurations. On the other hand, as we look towards the future, digital platforms and edge clouds are likely to assume an increasingly significant role. This development may, for example, involve a greater degree of end-user participation, as well as the emergence or introduction of novel edge-sharing participants. Finally, given the diversity of stakeholders and value chain constellations I mentioned, and considering the ongoing technical and market changes, we foresee a need for more network sharing agreements. It's essential to acknowledge that this includes various active and passive arrangements, sharing arrangements, and that optimal models are continually evolving. Bill and I recently published a paper focusing on some of these aspects. And with that, I shall pass the baton to my colleague, Bill Lehr. Bill, the floor is yours. Take it away.
All right, thanks. Volker, if you could just go to the next slide. So I have two slides, and I'm gonna try and go through these really fast. So both Volker and I, as noted, have written a bunch in this area and have been involved in a bunch of different issues that bear on these questions of things like market power and what's the role of public policy associated with different aspects of the internet, the domain name system, standardization processes, these sorts of things. And I think the point that's clear to policy folks and economists that have looked at this is the world really has changed. That the legacy internet is not the internet of today, and the economic environment is not the environment of yesterday. And a lot of the goals and values that worked in the past that we want to preserve mean something different today. In the telecommunications space, there's a bunch of issues that always show up and always have showed up and will continue to show up. Network management interconnection regulation, universal service policy, and competition are just three examples, and they're threaded throughout the Communications Act, the FCC, and other regulatory authorities around the country, around the world. With respect to network management interconnection, the biggest debate we've heard about over the last bunch of years is net neutrality. If you ask yourself what neutrality means in the network we're building, some version of 5G, it means something like network slicing, which means how do you share infrastructure? Answering that question is a hell of a lot more difficult than answering the question about net neutrality. We wasted 10 years backing away from the stupid argument that all packets should be treated the same. Anybody that's involved in network research said all packets should not be treated the same. That's what network management's all about. It's designed to sort of figure out if it's a malware packet or a DDoS packet, get rid of it. If it's good traffic, treat it well. When you get to something like 5G, it's a much, much more complicated problem. Universal service. We're now going to spend $40 billion in the United States putting fiber to every broadband serviceable location in the United States. Why we're going to do that, I don't know. I think that's crazy, but we're going to spend $40 billion. This is a debate that lots of people ought to weigh in on and should weigh in on. But even once we get that, when we get that, What are we going to do with that? What are the things that go beyond broadband? What should we subsidize? How should we subsidize it? How do we measure it? These are all big problems. And then finally, the first talk, Cory Doctorow's talk, was largely, and a lot of what like the focus of the group is, how do we restore meaningful competition so that the future of the internet isn't in the hands of a very small number of players? All of these are complicated questions. There's a lot of sophisticated analysis going on by a bunch of different people in the technology sector, developing technologies trying to respond to this, and by the economists. We're in the midst of a major attempt to redo competition law in the United States. Jeff Houston commented and made reference to Justice Brandeis. That is called by some of the people as the neo-Brandesian movement. That is something right now. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out, but that's something that technologists ought to think about informing themselves on. And then there's a whole host of other issues, things that I've been thinking a little bit about. Cybersecurity, for example, there is no solution to cybersecurity. That's a battle we'll continue to have to fight. It's an all hands on deck thing, and we are going to be facing a major collision between privacy and lawful access over end-to-end encryption and what should happen there, and that's an international battle that's going on. The blockchain, crypto, financial regulation stuff, and fintech, that's a whole other area. You know, it's temporarily self-destructed over the, say, Bankman-Freud nonsense. And then, of course, AI regulation was a new thing. So these are all issues. Go to the next slide, Volker. Go to the next slide, yeah. So three things. One is we're economists that want to engage these debates, are engaged these debates with the regulatory authorities in the US and abroad, and standards bodies and other technical research. We want to have collaboration with technical people. We hope that when you see the slides, you'll look at the papers and you'll get in touch with us about specific papers and comments if any of the people participating in this have an interest. Multidisciplinary engagement and feedback is absolutely necessary. Cory Doctorow's point of view and the things he expressed in the beginning is a point of view. It is certainly represented by a number of people. It is far not, I would say, a mainstream point of view or a dominant point of view amongst most of the people that are typically involved in the regulatory and policy debates. And so to have these kinds of arguments and have them be able to take place in a coherent way, we need people involved in this. Fundamentally, we're going into a future where asymmetric information and the measurements that happen in that world so that you can do informed evidence-based policy making are going to be critical. And if the measurements and the data and the evidence people bring to the table actually influences decisions as opposed to just being, nonsense blather like so much of the crap that's in the media, the popular media today, that's driven so many people away from reading newspapers because they're like, what's the point? It's just a horse race. If those things are going to have meaning, anything that does is going to be strategic, and you're going to have to think about the strategic implications of who's involved. And we need to think about designing an ecosystem, which means that the provenance of the metrics, the measurements, and careful thinking about how these things are used and analyzed is going to be important. And that's going to take a lot of help from academics, technologists that really understand how the systems work, and social scientists and economists that understand how these things are thinking about how these things actually impact the real world. And then finally, the ability to frame ex-ante rules that'll determine how the networks operate, that may have always been a suspect goal. It's completely impossible today. The state space that we're going into in a global internet where everything's digital is just way too large. We're going to have to figure out and build mechanisms that are capable of detecting when harms are happening and developing more reactive market-based ways to respond to that. In looking at the platforms, we could sit there and pick out individual platforms and say, that's a bad actor. Blow up Facebook, blow up Amazon, blow up Microsoft, blow up Apple, blow up Cisco, blow up Huawei. Where do we start? What are the companies? What's the ecosystem? Each of those guys runs an ecosystem of platforms. And if you go after Google and do something because of its search dominance or something like that, you have to ask yourself, what does that do for Amazon? And figuring that out is not easy. It's not that you shouldn't care, but there's a lot of thinking that needs to happen there. And the right way to do that is, I think, to have more informed dialogue from engineers, people in the communities building the stuff, talking to the policymakers, because we can't do what economists have said for a long time. Regulatory policy is the captive of economists' wisdom from 20 years ago. We got to bring all of that forward, because the economists, a lot of the economists and policymakers in this space think of the internet in terms of the way it used to be. They think of an internet that was governed by traditional, unpaid peering and transit, and that the transit funds and revenues are what funded the revenue. That's not the internet of today, and maybe we can't even go back there. And if we could go back there, we might not want to. But we have to figure out what to do with today's internet, which is a really different animal, and what we want to be public and shared in the public utility, and how we want to have access to what, and who should contribute to it. These are all questions that there are no simple answers to. So let me wrap there.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Volker and Bill, for coming to us and for sharing your work with us. We have time for 2 questions. So I see AJ in the queue. Is that correct? Maybe it's Wednesday. Then let's move on with Tobias.
So good morning, everyone. Tobias Fiebig, Max Planck Institute for Informatics, speaking for myself and not my affiliation. You mentioned that you're expecting significant investment from the private sector in infrastructure. I recently claimed that infrastructure operation in a careful and maintainable manner is incompatible with the concept of profit. So I'm wondering, how do you expect the private sector to profit from the infrastructure that is needed to sustain our society, given that it might be hard to actually get a profit from that infrastructure?
Well, the telecoms network was built as a national utility in most countries, and in the U.S. we built it with AT&T, which is a private monopoly. And we can argue about whether that was a good model or not, but it's how we did it. Almost everybody kind of agreed we need to move away from that. And had we not moved away from that, we never would have ended up with the internet the way we have today. And the original investment in the internet was a small amount of investment at the edges that took advantage of the public utility aspects of the internet. Now we're in a place where we may say that significant portions of the investment ought to be public utilities. And that's a debate, and there's some people, smart people, that actually believe that. And I wouldn't dismiss that point of view, but I would say that if you thought about trying to actually move us in that direction, you're going to need a really good argument for how you get there, and you're going to face some very, very significant resistance from basically everybody that's investing in this space. And the fact of the matter is, if you actually look at the empirical numbers, most of the money that they're talking about, if you look at the investment by private actors, it absolutely dwarfs the public investment that's available here. So either we say there's a whole lot of money that's got to come from the public sector, general tax revenues that are put towards this public utility, and then it's regulated, or we have to figure out how to manage private actors. And if we're managing private actors, we have to figure out, how we allow them to see an incentive in doing what they're doing. So, it's a hard problem. This is why I think that the policy issues are important.
Yeah, and Tobias, could you perhaps share your paper? That would be nice. It would be
Yes.
wonderful. You send it by email, please. Thank you.
Okay, Colin.
Hi, Colin Perkins. Interesting talk. Thank you very much. One of the, I forget quite how you phrased it. You said the policy was driven by economic theory from 20 years ago. To what extent do you see the problems we're seeing as being due to the mismatch in speed of innovation in the regulatory environment versus the technical environment?
I see that as a really key factor. And I think it's the fact that basically the technologies have gotten good enough that I think regulation at a national sovereign level is really, really hard. And I think that the key instrument will be architecture and standardization, because I don't think any of the international bodies right now, if you just asked yourself, maybe in the old days, Cisco designed a router and that was the internet, and we might not have loved it, but we kind of knew whatever we thought of Cisco. Then, you know, the FCC could sit and say, well, we own ICANN and we could just tell other people, the rest of the world, what to do. And that world no longer exists, and that's a good thing. But who would we stand up? The ITU or a completely new formulated ICANN or the World Bank or Amazon or any of these other guys? None of those people are great candidates. The best hope, I think, is in standards and intelligent architectures that allow options. And one of the problems about getting standards is if someone came out with a good technology is how do you get people to adopt it and deploy it? That's a big economic challenge and a tough one. So definitely entry ought to be feasible, but you're not going to get entry. You know, there's also security reasons. You can't just sit there and say, you know, everybody's got to make any source code has to be public and it all has to be totally shared. That's just not going to work. There's a lot of room for open source, but not everything's going to be open source. So.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks again, Volker and Bill, for sharing your work. There are really many interesting things to unwrap and respond to in your presentation. I hope we can do that on the mail list, and we're really looking forward to discussing these things more with you in the future. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Great, and so finally we have a local presenter in the room, and that's Christian Schudin. I can still bring up his presentation. Oh, that's not the right one.
Hello, my name is
Hello,
Christian
Christian.
Schudin. Yes, hello, Dirk. Should I start? Is that okay?
Yes, please, go ahead. Do you have a clicker to advance your slides, or should I do it?
Please, yes, if you could do that for me.
Okay.
Can you click once, please? So a month ago, I was at the decentralized web Camp Navarro, 2 hours north from San Francisco. Tim Berners-Lee was there, but also a lot of young people, the D-Web movement, so to speak. And they kind of liked the atmosphere. Things are crumbling or burning, and we have alternatives. But at the same time, you realize they play the same game as the others. They all run around and say, look at me, look at me, look at me, and we are the better ones. Come to us. And if people are really doing that, how do the other people find where we are? Next slide, please. So that is what is at the core. We have a lot of options now. And if you do the move to go to another platform, you have to leave traces. You have to inform others how you can be reached, how you keep the family together, how important things are kept. So even if things are burning, there are some things you have to preserve. And in networking, next slide, please, we know that this is the rendezvous problem. It's the initial problem of even before you establish communication, you know how to know where to communicate, how to communicate. It is that classic example of two people meeting in a large park. If both decide to not move around and find each other, they will never find each other. If both move around, the chances are very slim. Maybe it's better that one party stays, the other searches. But how do you coordinate that? You haven't communication. So there's really an intrinsic hard problem there. In networking, we have that the same. We use standards and everybody doesn't have to think about how to do things. We have to address that in that now burning environment that we have. Next slide, please. So here is a suggestion to fill that small gap that I think is there, and we have to address that. We shouldn't think about having a kind of a common element where everybody can look up where everybody else is. We would just build a new platform. We also shouldn't overload existing platforms like DNS to have a record where everybody can be located. These are single point of failures, and in many cases we know DNS is not working when it should and when it's most urgently needed. So the story that I got out from all the talking with decentralized web people is we have to disintermediate, and it is possible for a small amount of information. And this is what my talk is about, how to solve the rendezvous problem without platforms. Next slide, please. So that is the way I would phrase it. Think about generic right that each human entity is allowed to send 200 bytes a month. That is the novelty that you are allowed to ingest and to use any means to convey that information. I don't talk about protocols or infrastructures to make that happen, but just an entitlement. And once you have it, you will find your ways. Others will come and provide ways to do that. And why I brought here my antenna here, this is a shortwave antenna. Typically shortwave, it has wavelengths from 20 to 80 meters. This is shortwave antenna for 10 meters. With a laundry clip, I move it to 20 meters bandwidth. With that antenna and such a transceiver, 5 watts, you reach Japan and back. So that is what you can do end to end without intermediaries. So this is not science fiction. We have technical solutions to let people speak at long distances. And there are ways we should imagine to push that forward. There are also kind of the so-called pocket switch networking where people run around with USB sticks. All this is okay if there is a awareness that people should be allowed to do that. If they have found a way, they should not be stopped by police or somebody else to do that. So next slide, please. So how did I came up with that number? And it might be not an exact number. You could use that exactly for spreading your new social media handle where you are. But we can also have cryptographic usage of that. If you want to say, oh, I had a compromise on one of the key, use the other one. You can also have a redirection, how we call it in computer science, saying, I'm out of town, please contact this person. But also for emergency situation, we need kind of something that doesn't depend on turning off the Skynet or whatever. And the other reason why to go low is not because it would be nice to have more, but 200 bytes a month, you can't do much harm. This is something that is still manageable. Next slide, please. I'm almost at the end. So what is the overall volume? It's quite small. If you collect everything, if you do the multiplication, everything fits on one of these small USB sticks. Then it's also something that is not really novel. Others do that already for trust reasons, because you can't have a trusted central entity. All server certificates are collected and globally rebroadcasted and kept in multiple repositories that everybody can check that everybody is doing the same thing. And you need broadcasts to do that. And is the industry paying for that? And finally, so about the feasibility, you could also, if that is a common right to do, why not also ask the platforms to provide you this? So Apple provides you emergency channels. Why not the 200 bytes a month? It's really not a big load. On top of that, what they want to offer you. Next slide, and that's the final one, I think. So that is at the core. So burning everything down is fine, but there are things which have to stay. So we can keep contacts to solve the rendezvous problem and make it really more easier to do that switching. Don't think about creating the new platform, but expressing the need and the right to use such a channel. And if you use a lighthouse thing, don't build the gigantic lighthouse that collects all that information. Just allow each individual persons, if they want to do so, to operate their own channel. That is what I think is a core thing for decentralizing. With that, we will always be at the mercy of others solving the rendezvous problem for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Christian. So I would have a couple of questions, but I see we have Eric in the queue. So Eric, you have the floor first.
Hey, Eric Oswald, George Mason University. It's very interesting. I like the idea, but I had a question. So it sort of feels a little bit like the forest tree falling in the woods and no one's there to hear it. So do you need a platform to capture the broadcast in case the recipient you want to hear it wasn't listening when you sent it?
Yes, but I mean, the platform, you could try to have several platforms offering that. You would not build one to do it. I agree, the store and forward, or what, as mentioned, the asynchronous communication offered by Facebook and the others is one of the value that helps in the rendezvous. We would have to do that. But who knows, maybe these devices, they just listen a month long and they filter on what you are interested in. So also technically, we could even go around the store and forward necessity, but we would have to explore that.
So one question I had is, what is the trust infrastructure that you need for that? How can you trust these messages?
That is typically observation trust is created out of band, and then you use it in the system. In the past, for a server certificate, this is really 90s, you had to physically show up at the certificate issuer and prove that you are a representative of that university to get a certificate for that. Now we have Let's Encrypt, where it's just proving that you have the DNS name. So it's out of band in principle, and the decentralized people do that. They have signing parties, you know with whom you talk, and from that on, later on, you can reconnect later. If it's out of the blue and we're talking to somebody you never met, then you have a problem, but that is not addressing this one. We have already some trust anchors, and you want to continue using that. You simply lost the person out of sight, and you want to reconnect later.
Okay, thanks.
I put myself in the queue, sorry, that security is based on identity. You mentioned earlier, like DNS as a platform or somehow centralized, but isn't the DNS merely just a naming system, allocating names, right? And without identifier, how would you attach your security onto it? You mentioned the institutions can issue you a certificate. You shall we can issue me a certificate with my name, and therefore you don't need a namespace, correct? If not a DNS, and what would be that namespace?
Well, the namespace I'm using right now is from Secure Scuttlebutt. It's a ED25519 key, randomly generated. And I have other people's, when I have a signing party, know that this is me. I can transfer that information. I can have trusted friends which collect maybe that information. We can do that grassroots up if we know each other. If it's a different story if we talk about banking relationship, things like that. There must be probably some trust industry thing vouching for this is really the ED25519 from this bank or not. But here I was more looking at the end user perspective, and I think this is a proposal exactly for these guys.
Given we are out of time, so let's talk later. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought we were out of time. My name's Ben Gehring. I was sorry if you explained this, but can you elaborate on how you would propose to enforce this like 200 byte quota? Like what would prevent me from doing a 201st byte within a month using your proposal? Like how do you enforce the quota on the entitlement?
Yep. I was anticipating a little bit that, yes, I was anticipating a little bit that comment, and it made me smile because I have found out that the radio amateurs, they have internalized the restriction the government put on them since 100 years, and now they are the cops on the airwaves, and they try to make sure, and you seem now to be taking the role of the government and making sure that we do not overstep. I think the answer is that if you think about the device here, you could do a lot of problems, and we have had that email that you shouldn't use your personal hotspot here. So we give people already that technology to disrupt things. If you make a cheap device for doing that minimal global broadcast, people will typically not open it, not hack it. And even if it's worldwide, 100,000 people abuse that, the rest of the vast majority will simply use the tool as it was built, it was meant to be used. So I'm not afraid of that really.
Okay, there are actually quite some interesting questions in the chat. Let me just pick one maybe to wrap this up. So let me just echo Dave, who was asking, Christian, so why do you think the web of trust approaches haven't been successful in the past?
You do a lot of data cleaning up, keeping up to date your contact lists. This is some really convenience that you get by the centralized platforms that keep that for you. And so you see a lot of manual stuff that you have to do. I stopped doing signing parties now, except when I came back to these decentralized things. But it's much more difficult to easily grow. Now I just exchange phone numbers. I mean, these contacts still exist. It's a way to bootstrap trust. So I wouldn't single it out. It has become much easier than in the past. In Secure Scalbot, you scan the QR code on your friend's phone, and that's all you need. You never have to type in something. So we can make that frictionless or easier than it was in the past with the typical old 90s style signing parties.
Okay, thanks. So unfortunately, we are out of time. It has been a really interesting and very lively session. So thank you everybody who presented and everybody who participated in the discussion. Really enjoyed it. Hope to see you all again soon. Enjoy your break. Bye-bye.